appreciate being here. You have a beautiful state that over the years with my family, we've enjoyed the beautiful lakes up there, coastline, mountains. It's just a spectacular place. And I look forward to being there in person with you in October. But now, what I wanted to do tonight was just give you a preview, a little bit of a sense of my story and how I came to school board service, and then ultimately how I decided to write a book about school boards, and then just a high level of some of the things that I wrote about in the book. And it'll be a really good, I think, preview in terms of what we're going to talk about in much more detail when we are together in person in October. So I will start at the beginning and go back to my story about the first place that I had an experience with public schools. Here I am with my mom and my brother, in addition to doing a lot of outdoor activities, especially in the fall, which is a great time of year. My mom was a school teacher. She taught kindergarten in a public school for over 30 years in a place called Rockland County, New York, in a school called Limekiln. And so I used to go with her every fall and set up her classroom. And I remember, the blocks and the books, and most importantly, the inspiration that I got from watching her being really excited about the start of a new school year. All these kids coming into the public system for the first time, and really that kindergarten year being preparation for the rest of their elementary years and beyond. And it was really inspirational. And she had a great career. And then I went to public school myself, and this is me in my yearbook when I graduated from a place called Spring Valley High School. And I had a great experience there as well, prepared me well for college. I was really appreciative of having a great set of friends. I loved my teachers. I expressed thanks, when I left, to the administrators. It was overall a great experience. And then after college, I took a direction of going to Wall Street. And on Wall Street, I spent over 20 years working with companies and their boards. And I thought about board governance from a corporate perspective, thought about strategy, thought about management, thought about finance. But like a lot of us, I think, that get into school board service, when I had kids that started in the public schools in my region here in suburban New York, I decided that I wanted to try to spend some volunteer time. And I became a member of the board of an education foundation that was charged to raise money for the public schools. And what we did was we tried to fund projects that couldn't be done out of the public school budget that were innovative. And we got those ideas from administrators and from teachers. The organization had been around for 20 years. I took over as chair, and then pretty much overnight, this was back in 2013, 2014 timeframe, the ideas just stopped. No more ideas. And at first I thought it was something that I was doing, being the chair. And then I realized that it was Race to the Top, which was very aggressively being rolled out in New York. New York was one of the most aggressive early states for Race to the Top. And in my school district and in the school districts around me, and they were very diverse, all kinds of different socioeconomic demographics and racial demographics, didn't matter. There was universal opinion that this program was upending public schools in our region. And so I became so interested in public policy and how this policy could be so destructive when it was meant to obviously, do good for public schools, that I decided to leave my job. And I went and I focused on researching Race to the Top in New York and nationally. And I did that for a year at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And then I really was inspired to run for school board because I thought I can do something locally to try to make a difference, because I thought that juxtaposition of this state and federal policy that was failing, maybe I could do something at the local level. And I've, over the last 10 years, served on my local school board, and it's been an incredible experience, and I've been really fortunate. And in the midst of doing that, I've spent a lot of time with different state association leadership, as well as working at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, which was focused on mental health in K-12 schools, working with different superintendents and their staffs around the country. And then it was during COVID, when I probably had too much time on my hands, but I was thinking that it's time to think about governance, and it's time to think about why there's not much written about school boards, and they kind of go under the radar. And I thought about my experience in the corporate world versus the education world. Corporate world, boards are essential focus. You learn about them in business school. If you're an investor in a company, you think about whether the board governance is good or if it's faulty, and that determines how excited you are about the opportunity to invest in a company. But then you go to the education world, and first off, boards are perceived as quite boring. And when I first became a school board member in 2015, and I'm walking in my town, I come across a person that I knew in town who came up to me and said, "Oh, congratulations on winning the race. This is great because I'm going to see you on the video stream online because I watched the school board meetings." And at that point in 2015, not a lot of people were watching school board meetings. And so I was pretty excited by this. I'm like, wow, somebody's actually going to watch the meeting. And then he went on to say, yeah, I'm having a lot of trouble falling asleep. And lately these meetings are the perfect, anecdote because I just watch the meeting and I fall right asleep. We're talking about budget line items, we're talking about policy language, kind of boring. And it's fascinating because you go to education schools, not a lot of focus on school boards, research in the academic world, not a lot of focus. And of course, we all know that there are many people out there that argue that there should be an alternative governance model to running public schools rather than elected school boards. That is something that's been expressed by many policymakers through the years, and so it's not like it is in the business world. And I went back and I thought as I was writing about my experience in public school and the fact that I thought about thanking everyone under the sun except for the school board. I really didn't have much attention and focus on the school board at that point. And as I was researching for the book, I really, was reminded of the fact that we had a woman named Georgine Hyde who was the president of the board of our district and was on the board for over 30 years. She was a legend. She did an incredibly amazing job at taking what was a district that didn't have a tremendous amount of financial means and really creating a top-class school district in New York State in terms of outcomes. She was universally well respected. She was the leader of the State School Boards Association, then ultimately had a role even at the National School Board Association. And she had an amazing story because she was a survivor of Auschwitz. Her entire family died in the camps, but she got out, made her way to the United States, and through her, son attending public school, decided to serve, and the rest was kind of history. And so I really was inspired by the story, and I write about it in the beginning of the book as really just a precursor to how we should all be thankful for those that dedicate so much time and public service to our system. So, with that, I started this book, and I'm going to share with you some of the high level. And again, in October, when I'm with you in person, we'll go in much more detail. But really, we'll bucket it into three different categories. First off, just thinking about the challenges of the current environment. And then secondly, and we're only going to spend a minute on it tonight, but I'll go into much more detail, why I believe that specifically school boards can be a great force to strengthen public education in a different way than anybody can do at the state or federal levels. And then lastly, a topic that I didn't think about a lot before I was writing the book, but by the time I was done, it was really a central focus. And I think maybe one of the most important takeaways that I have, which is how do we think about school boards in our overall democracy and this world that's incredibly polarized? And how can we also be a force for good there, which I think we can. So first, the boring world of school boards obviously changed in 2020, right around the time that I was starting this book. Lots of headlines on this page that talks about, things that have happened. We all know some of the stories. I'm going to play this quick clip that I've been showing over the last few months because I think it's just really indicative of, all kinds of stuff that happens in school boardrooms. This is from California, and it's from about 6 months ago.
Hi, good evening. I'm a parent in the Davis Unified School District, and I'm here today to talk about the policies you have for the locker rooms in the junior high schools. So Emerson, Holmes, Harper Junior High. Right now, we require our students to undress for PE class. So I'm just going to give you an idea what that looks like when I undress. So right now, this school district is saying that depending on a child's transgender identity, that they can pick which bathroom they want. So we have, right now at this school district, we have children self-identifying into different bathrooms just based off of their, no, you cannot. I have my bathing suit on. Excuse me, this is allowed.
We're gonna recess.
So you get the picture. So I was showing this just recently to a regional school board association former executive director who was the one who did my governance training 10 years ago. And I'm like, during our governance training, you never prepared us for somebody coming to the microphone at public comment period and starting to dress down to their bathing suit to prove a point. So we know that there's just all kinds of stuff that's happened across the country. And one interesting thing that I would share when I started writing the book was I went to talk to publishers, and the question that I got, which surprised me at the time, but not anymore, is what side am I on? And I'm like, what do you mean by what side am I on? And the question was really about whether or not I was going to write a book from a conservative or a progressive perspective. And the reason that they asked that question was because they couldn't care less which of the two approaches I was taking, but they wanted to know who they were going to market the book to. We're so segmented now, and there's two different worlds, so they wanted to know which world. And when I said I wanted to write more thoughtful book about school boards more holistically, they were uninterested. And I ended up with an academic publisher, MIT Press, which worked out really well because they had room for a book that wasn't, particularly political from one standpoint or another. But this is very recent research that I just came across that was done by two researchers who did a survey of school board members across the country, and they looked at board members that pinned themselves as Democratic versus Republican, and then they asked a bunch of questions and they showed the responses based on the Democratic board members versus the Republican board members. And you can see, and this is not particularly surprising, but some of
Mm.
the numbers are pretty stark in terms of their differences, that we do live in very different worlds that oftentimes do coincide with our political beliefs around many things that relate to schools. So whether that's charters, whether that's views on how racism and slavery might be taught in schools, whether it's book restrictions, whether it's impact of or effect of unions on schools. You see here very different numbers. And when they also showed these numbers with the broad general public in America, you had similar divergences as you did with the board member universe that you see on this page. And so certainly we are very divided on many issues, and that often plays out in the boardroom, and that creates tension. And these are also some new statistics that have come out relatively recently. There's a group out of Princeton called Bridging Divides, and they've been measuring threats and harassment for local public officials. So this includes schools, this includes town government, county government, and you can see, no surprise, that the number of incidents has been rising, and specifically about a third of school board members reported in their surveys that they had reported some hostility around the work that they did. And they talk about something that I think is really powerful, which I also touch on in my book, this cycle of escalation where you have a lot of polarization nationally, you have incidents that happen locally. It all feeds together to create a more hostile environment. And then there's also some work that Ballotpedia did with asking respondents to rate the board's internal conflict, and 46% said it was very high, although
Mm.
some of that also leads to productive outcomes, and 62% said the conflict actually in the end was productive. So I think that's interesting. But we know we're living in a macro environment that is quite challenging. And the other thing that we know, which is unique to our times and hasn't always been like this, is that the impact of social media makes our work very different. Because now, if we're sitting at the board table and everything is being videoed, and ultimately there's a clip that somebody finds to be interesting or sensational, that clip can end up literally around the internet and in the hands of millions of viewers in a relatively quick period of time. Here are some examples. Of course, there are many others. But at the end of the day, as much as we struggle over specific issues, whether we have differences across political lines, there is one issue that I don't think we think about quite as often, that in a way is the overarching issue. And this is something that we actually see more uniformity on, and there's not such a split between right and left. And the question is, regardless of where you stand on an issue, where should it be adjudicated? Should it be decided at the local level? Should it be decided at the state level? Should it even be decided at the federal level? And to the extent that there is an issue that's, let's say, decided at the state level, what precedent does that set for decisions that might come after in the future? And this question around local control versus state versus federal, this age-old question, I think, is incredibly important. And we've seen evidence that over, all kinds of states, whether it's red or blue, there's certainly more of a tension now with the state playing a larger role in many of the policy issues that we ultimately see down at the board level. One of the things that we always struggle with is parent rights versus government control. That's been something that's been true for a long time. Where is that line between what parents have a say in versus what government has a say in? And if you look at the quote on the left, you're forbidden to coerce, influence, force any human being to be part of medical treatment. You have, zero authority to infringe on constitutional rights, and you'll be held liable. And violation of our civil liberties is an act of tyranny, and Nevada parents are on duty. That's a quote that comes from Reno, Nevada, back in 2021 about vaccine mandates during COVID. On the right-hand side, there's a very similar quote. Thousands of parents who believe that vaccination is most harmful. We respectfully and urgently request that this non-enforceable rule be withdrawn. You have no authority to make willingness to undergo vaccination a requirement, and we're prepared to contest this question. Very similar quote, but this is actually from 1912 in Portland, Oregon, and it was around the smallpox vaccine. So one thing that I learned as I did my research and I look back in history is that time and time again, lots of different reasons, lots of different issues, but this parent rights versus government control has certainly been pervasive. And so that's nothing new. The social media aspect is new, but this is nothing new. But what's really changed is if you look over the course of American history, school boards in the early days, and they were around in the very early days, did absolutely everything. States delegated full authority to boards to really control what was happening in local schools. And what's happened over time, little by little, for some very, very good reasons and for some not so good reasons, is that there has been a pretty dramatic shift to mostly state, some national authority and power, where now local boards and states, and to again, lesser extent, the federal government, share in the power in a much different way than used to exist. And we don't look at this day by day, but when you look at it decade over decade, the trend is very, very clear. And now we've gotten to a point where states will vehemently disagree on what the state policies might be. So you might see something in Tennessee and you might see the opposite in Washington state. Literally, one's banning, one's mandating. That is common these days. And sometimes with the cell phone ban, that might be universal, where you see lots of different states do it. But the point is that we're seeing legislation, we're seeing various mandates that are coming from state capitals in just a very different way than used to come. And whether, again, you agree with it or not is almost beside the point. The bigger point is, should these things be happening at the state level, or should we potentially be advocates for having some of these things be more flexible so that the decision can be made at the local level? And where should that line be? And I think that now transitioning to the second piece, and again, we'll talk a lot more about this in October, but a big portion of my book talks about how you could have the most well-meaning state legislative delegation or regulatory body, state, board, state education board. You could have the most well-meaning governor that really wants to improve public schools. But there are limitations to how much you could do from a state capital. When you're looking down on all the districts in a state like Maine, or where I come from, a state like New York, where you have many districts that are very diverse, school board members sit in the organization. We are part of the district, and we sit at that ground level where we're the governance body for that organization. And just like a board that oversees a hospital or oversees a nonprofit or a corporation, there is a benefit that we have from being part of the district slash organization. And I have 5 chapters where I talk about how these are things that can really only be done at the local level. The first being initiatives and initiative fatigue, because we all know that in the classroom, many teachers suffer from a lack of autonomy because there are so many different initiatives that are pushed forth by the time you get to the classroom. And boards really can serve as this mechanism, particularly if they had a bit more flexibility, to be that arbiter of making sure that there's a reasonable number of initiatives at any one time, because no organization can do everything. District climate. If you look at some of the polling, and I'll share in October some of the work that we did when I was at Yale, obviously district climate is an incredibly important thing to have be positive, so that it's a great place where students and teachers and staff are engaged and they want to come to the buildings and they want to be enthusiastic about engaging with others in their community. And district climate is really set at the board and administrative level. So that board superintendent relationship, that boardroom decor, that really does have great influence over what a district climate might look like. You can't legislate climate from a centralized level. And of course, engaging with the community. That's another important one, because we're ultimately part of our communities. And the way that we know boards are set up are with mechanisms to listen to the community before we come to those decision points. And it's done with transparency. And so it's a very unique democratic process, little d. Accountability. And what I mean by that is we all think about state accountability and report cards and test scores, but we also know that each one of our districts faces specific challenges. There may be a district in Maine struggling with academic proficiency. There may be another district where their issue is not academic proficiency because their results are strong in that category, but maybe they have stress and anxiety issues in their high school, or absenteeism, or other factors. And what we can do at the local level is we can set up accountability mechanisms that matter for our local community. And then we can measure that over time. That can't be done centralized. And then lastly, thinking about the long term, we all have different issues that we face in our districts. Let's say two districts next to each other, one has increasing enrollment, the other has declining enrollment. Those are two very different dynamics. They're going to mean very different budgetary aspects. They're going to mean different personnel and sort of operational management decisions. A board can look at the issue in their district and calibrate, whereas when you're doing it more centrally over many, many districts, it's hard to get that nuance. So for all those reasons, I think we have a really unique opportunity in front of us to strengthen our districts. But then going to the last piece of what I want to talk about tonight as the preview, which is the linkage to democracy. So researchers recently came out with a study where they looked at 100,000 hours of school board videos and they looked at school board conflict. And they did witness that since 2020, we've seen more conflict in boardrooms. That's probably not going to surprise anyone, listening to me right now, given what we've seen in our respective states. But when they looked at really intense conflict, the conflict that you see on YouTube videos that could be, at times destructive, that really was concentrated in a very small number of districts. Overall, what happens in Maine, what happens across America in school board rooms, as school boards have meetings and at different times of the year, is civil discourse at its best. And it's people that are disagreeing with each other that come together into a space and they express those disagreements. And then ultimately you have to render some type of a decision when a vote is taken. When you think about it, that is what our college campuses are trying to strive for and they struggle with, yet it's happening in school board meetings. This is some new research that, again, very recently came out at the end of the year. It was around December. There was a study put out by the Carnegie Corporation, which is a foundation based here out of New York. And they looked at, they asked leaders locally. So this was not just schools, but they asked leaders in county government, in state government, in town government across the board. What do you think about the impact of political polarization as it relates to our country and our national politics and then our local community? And what the survey showed is that the vast majority of respondents, well, almost 90%, which is the red and the orange on the left-hand side, said that the polarization really impacted our country a great deal or a lot. And you probably have to be like under a rock not to, think that, see the polarization that's happening in our national politics. Yet, when they asked the same question about the impact that it was having on their local community, that red and orange, answer was a much smaller number of respondents. It was a minority of the respondents, not a majority. And so there's a big difference with the perception of polarization at the national level versus the local. And I think we have a real opportunity at the local level because as difficult as it is to navigate differences, we can all be in the same room, we can all be in the same community, and even though, yes, things happen on social media and local communities too, our national politics are often fought on the far corners of the internet with anonymity. Whereas in school board meetings, we're there in person and we understand that there are other human beings that may think differently than we do. And we have to kind of work through that as a process. And then these same local leaders were asked, let's look at all of the local institutions that exist. Which ones foster civic participation? And K-12 schools came up at the top of the list, with people really saying that that's a place where civic participation is encouraged, is fostered, and it's really healthy for our overall democracy. Just a couple of final points here. One of the things that I came across, which I thought was fascinating, was this concept of island districts. And that is a district that would be in a state where the politics don't match. So Austin, Texas, liberal in a conservative state. Smithtown, which is a town in Long Island, New York, which obviously we're here in a liberal state, but Smithtown is more conservative. And what the study found around these island districts is didn't matter what their politics were, left or right, but there was an increased incidence in threats and some harassment of school officials, teachers in these communities versus the general public. And it's no surprise when you think about it, because if many of the decisions are being made at the state level, if you're in a community that doesn't match the state politics, you become a little bit more disenfranchised and frustrated. And I think we've probably all been in situations in school board races where somebody's running on a platform where once they get into office, they may not even have the ability to make the changes they're talking about
Mm.
because of state mandates or state bans or state rules and regulations. And there's a little bit of misperception there where oftentimes even school board members and state politicians, let alone the general public, may not always know where the authority lies and who ultimately has the authority. And we saw that during COVID in spades. And so I think this is a really interesting point in our local system gives us that ability to nuance. In October, I'll talk more about election structure, which in most states does have protections trying to some extent. And you don't see the same gerrymandering and some of the other things we see in our general elections and school board races. And then lastly, and I think this is a good place to end, trust. That ultimately, even though there's a lot of mistrust of the overall K-12 system in the United States at this point,
Mm.
which is sad, when asked about how satisfied you are with the quality of education your oldest child is receiving, that is something that respondents in surveys, and this is a survey by Gallup, which is reputable, really shows that the vast majority of Americans, well over 70%, over 75%, still say that they are completely or somewhat satisfied with that local education. So I think there's an opportunity to capitalize on that. And I'm going to end with the fact that as school board members, we can capitalize on trying to appreciate the fact that in our boardrooms, perhaps the process itself can be this unifying force where we know that there's a lot of messiness and there's a lot of differences of opinion on many, many issues. But if we all come together and we're transparent and we listen and ultimately, sometimes make tough decisions through that process, there's nothing more American and little d democratic than that. And so I'll end there, but I really do look forward to having a much deeper conversation with you in October where we can explore these issues in more detail and go through the education piece and the democracy piece, and most importantly, take questions and have a really good dialogue.
Scott, thank you so much. That was impressive, and I appreciate you continuing to share even more updated data than you did even in October. That's wonderful. I can't wait to see what you have to share with us in October of 2026.
Well, I look forward to it. I'm sure a lot will happen between now and then too. So
Yeah.
hopefully there'll be even more. One thing that's so interesting is when I first started writing the book, one of my big reasons was I just wanted to increase awareness. And one thing that has happened, and not because of my book only, but because of just so much news about school boards since sort of 2020 to present, there now is a larger focus on it in the academic research community, and there's more survey work being done and more people trying to understand what's going on out there. And I think that's really healthy and really good for all of us.
Excellent. I do, Joe, before we let Scott go have his dinner, I just want to say that I have the opportunity in my position as in MSMA and MSBA to work with boards from across the state. I was in Sanford today. I'll be in Bangor tomorrow. I'm heading up to Holton the week after that. One thing that I continuously hear from boards is that they're and you touched upon this, Scott, in your remarks, is there's their tacit reluctance to they want to know where can we debate topics, or where can we discuss things that we may not all agree on. And because I think there's this implicit belief that that the board meeting is not the place for that. And I love the fact that you're saying no, that's the perfect place to do it and to model it for everyone in our communities and our schools.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about, but we will in October, is just if we're thinking about making change in our schools and we're thinking about innovation in a way, it's really hard in the school board setting because the meetings are public and because it's out there for everyone to see, to go into a school board room and have a discussion with the superintendent and say, look, we know that there's an issue here, or we really need to do better here. So let's brainstorm innovation.
Hmm.
I think the tendency is to want to come in and say, here's the plan, here's the answer, this is what we're doing. And the healthiest process is sometimes we don't have all the answers, and sometimes we do need to debate a little bit. That's so easy to, well, I shouldn't say easy. Corporations, large corporations, even Fortune 500 company boards struggle with that. But I think good boards get comfortable with the ambiguity. The advantage that they have that we do not have is that they're behind closed doors. We're
Yeah.
not. It's great that everything's transparent. That's what makes school boards, quintessentially American and transparent, and that's the way it needs to be. But I think it makes it even harder for us to have those conversations that maybe we do need to make changes, or maybe we don't know the perfect answer, or to
Mm,
your point, maybe we do have this disagreement that we have to work through. I
mhm.
think, though, we just have to take a step back and remember that is part of the process, and we just
Yeah.
kind of sometimes have to embrace that and do the best we can to navigate it.
Yeah. Scott, thank you again. I'm going to turn it over to you, Joe, and take it away.
I'm just going to give one real quick plug for Scott's book because it really is a great read. I'm sure you can find it online. Just Google Why School Boards Matter.
Yeah, and if
Appreciate
you,
it.
yeah, and we'll have those available at the conference as well. So, yeah.
Okay, I
Scott,
think
have a good
Well, it's
evening.
great to
Thank
be
you for
with
coming.
you. I look forward to being there in person because your state again is amazing, and so I always love coming up there. So I will see you in October.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to read Scott's book, Why School Boards Matter, available on Amazon, Penguin Random House, the MIT Press, and bulk orders via BookPal. He'll be the keynote speaker at our MSMA Fall Conference, which will take place at the Augusta Civic Center on October 29th and 30th. More details coming soon. Be sure to like the video and subscribe for more videos from Maine School Management Association. Planting the seeds for Maine's future.